In February of 2022, a case emerged from Warrick County, Indiana, that left a lasting impact on the community's memory. The case centered on a 3-month-old baby boy named Silas Chance Kent Scott. Records show Silas was born healthy, a newborn with his life ahead of him, a life entirely dependent on his caregivers for survival. However, instead of receiving the necessary care and protection, Silas experienced a severe decline in health due to a lack of basic sustenance. The responsibility for his care fell to his parents, 3-year-old Kaylin Monroe and her boyfriend, Jacob Scott, who resided near Boonville in Warrick County. While their youth and inexperience were noted, investigators would later conclude that the circumstances went far beyond simple mistakes. Monroe reportedly admitted to investigators that she would sometimes forget to feed Silas, particularly if he was quiet or if her attention was on her other children. This statement, when later presented in a legal setting, highlighted a profound disconnect in the basic duties of infant care. How does a caregiver's perception of a quiet baby, a state often seen as positive, become a justification for a lapse in essential care? Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. And don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel to be the first to receive notifications when there are new videos. By the time emergency responders were called to the residence, it was too late. The coroner's report confirmed that Silas had passed away over a period of weeks from severe malnutrition and dehydration. The autopsy revealed a complete absence of nourishment in his digestive system. His physical condition, showing visible signs of emaciation, stood in stark contrast to the fact that food and formula were readily available within the home. Neighbors later reported that they had rarely seen the infant and did not recall hearing the typical cries of a hungry baby. While some noted the family seemed withdrawn, the severity of the situation unfolding behind closed doors remained unknown. In the quiet of that Warrick County home, the infant's signs of distress presumably weakened until they ceased altogether. The investigation that followed was described as deeply troubling, even for seasoned detectives. The prosecution constructed a timeline that indicated this was not a momentary lapse, but a sustained pattern of neglect spanning the entirety of Silas's short life. They argued that both Monroe and Scott had prioritized their own affairs over the fundamental needs of their child. The legal proceedings sought to establish accountability for Silas's death. In October 2024, a Warrick County jury was presented with the evidence, including the medical examiner's findings, investigators' accounts of the home's conditions, and Monroe's own statements. After weighing the testimony, the jury returned a verdict, finding Kaylin Monroe guilty of murder and neglect of a dependent, resulting in death. A month later, in November 2024, a judge sentenced her to 65 years in prison. The process for accountability continued in February 2025, when Silas's father, Jacob Scott, also faced the court. He pleaded guilty to neglect, resulting in death, and received a 40-year prison sentence. While his sentence was different, the legal outcomes for both parents affirmed a shared responsibility in the failure to provide their son with the basic necessities for life. For the family members who mourned Silas, the sentences offered a form of legal resolution but could not alleviate their profound loss. Relatives remembered him as an infant who never had the opportunity to experience the normal milestones of life. Instead of celebrating birthdays, the family is left to contemplate what could have been. The case of Silas Scott resonated deeply within Warrick County and across Indiana, becoming a touchstone for child advocacy groups. It served as a powerful example that severe neglect can be just as fatal as a direct act of violence, prompting difficult questions about community awareness and intervention. His name, which should have symbolized new life and innocence, is now linked to a preventable tragedy. His story is a plea for vigilance and for the simple, crucial act of paying attention, because the difference between life and death for a child can sometimes depend on whether someone chooses to see and act. Today, both of his parents are incarcerated, serving sentences that will span decades. In a world full of noise, how do we, as a society, learn to hear the profound and desperate silence of a child in need? In November 2012, law enforcement in Indianapolis were dispatched to a residence where they encountered a deeply distressing scene. Inside, they found a 2-month-old infant, Philip Roby, who was deceased. It was determined that he had been gone for several hours prior to their arrival. His weight was recorded at just 5 pounds, approximately half the expected weight for a healthy infant of his age. The physical evidence pointed to a state of severe emaciation. The coroner's report would later confirm the cause of death as complications from severe malnutrition, commonly referred to as starvation. Philip had reportedly been born healthy, with every opportunity to thrive. The investigation focused on his mother, 9-year-old Bambi Glazebrook. Instead of receiving the consistent nourishment and care essential for an infant's survival, Philip's short life was characterized by a critical lack of sustenance. By the end of his life, his physical condition had deteriorated significantly. What makes this case particularly tragic is the evidence that the outcome might have been preventable. Concerns had been raised by family members in the weeks leading up to his death. On October 24, 2012, a relative reported visiting the home and finding it in a state of disarray. She stated that the infant was not in a crib, but was instead found in a drawer of a piece of furniture. She described his physical state as alarmingly thin, to the point where his skeletal structure was prominent to the touch. This prompted her and another concerned relative to contact the police. The following day, on October 25th, officers from the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department, IMPD, conducted a welfare check at the home. Their official report, however, presented a starkly different assessment. The officers noted that the infant appeared alert and that the living conditions were acceptable, concluding there was insufficient justification to notify the Department of Child Services, DCS. This discrepancy raises a critical question. How can two contemporaneous observations of the same environment, one by a concerned family member and one by trained law enforcement, result in such fundamentally different conclusions? For Philip's family, this official account was incomprehensible. A cousin later told reporters, "I don't understand how officers could say everything was fine when he looked so sickly." Concurrently, the Indiana Department of Child Services, DCS, was also independently investigating Philip's welfare. Glazebrook had a prior history with the agency, having previously lost custody of 3 other children due to neglect, one of whom was a drug-exposed infant. Between September and October 2012, multiple reports had been filed with DCS warning that Philip was in danger. However, the agency encountered significant difficulties in making contact, initially going to an incorrect address on several occasions. When they did locate the correct residence, Glazebrook reportedly refused to answer the door, phone calls, or letters. This reveals a critical flaw in the system. Neither agency was aware of the other's involvement. IMPD was not informed that DCS had an active case, and DCS was not aware that police officers had just been inside the home and deemed it safe. Philip was caught in a procedural void between 2 siloed agencies. When Philip was found deceased just weeks later, the public and familial response was one of profound outrage. Relatives insisted his death was preventable, and child welfare advocates demanded systemic reforms to improve communication between law enforcement and child protective services. The case became a tragic case study in systemic failure, illustrating what can happen when warning signs are not escalated, when interagency communication breaks down, and when a family's desperate calls for help are not fully heard. In November 2012, Bambi Glazebrook was arrested. 2 years later, she pleaded guilty to neglect of a dependent, resulting in death. A judge sentenced her to 30 years in prison. Today, Glazebrook remains incarcerated. But for Philip's family, the legal outcome does not resolve their heartbreak. They live with the knowledge that his suffering could have been stopped. The case is not just about a parent's neglect. It is about a system that failed to connect the dots. His death remains one of Indiana's most haunting reminders that protecting children requires vigilance, communication, and decisive action. When multiple agencies are tasked with protecting a child, but operate in isolation, where does the ultimate accountability lie? And how can a society ensure that the seams between its safety nets never become a chasm into which a child can fall? In January of 2023, a one-year-old girl named Oakley Snow was removed from the security of her father's home in Oklahoma. At an age of learning to walk, she was taken by her mother, Madison Marshall, and her mother's boyfriend, Roan Waters. It would be the last time Oakley's father saw her alive. Too young to comprehend the precarious situation she was in, Oakley was transported across state lines into an unstable and hazardous environment. According to witness reports, Marshall and Waters were later seen with the child at a residence in Indianapolis associated with illicit drug activity, an environment universally recognized as unsafe for an infant. This was the last reported sighting of Oakley before an extensive search began. For weeks, family members and the community held on to hope for her safe return. Flyers bearing Oakley's image were widely distributed, and vigils were held as people prayed for a positive outcome. Her family made public pleas for any information that might lead to her location. But as time passed, a growing sense of concern began to overshadow the hope. That concern was tragically confirmed in April of 2023. Based on information provided by Madison Marshall herself, investigators were directed to an abandoned residence in Morgan County, near Morgantown. Inside the house, they made a solemn discovery. Oakley's remains were found concealed within a dresser drawer. The scene was described as deeply distressing, even for experienced law enforcement personnel. During questioning, Madison Marshall attempted to place primary responsibility on Roan Waters. She alleged that Waters had subjected Oakley to physical abuse at the Indianapolis residence and stated that she had been unable to intervene. However, the prosecution's case emphasized Marshall's own culpability. They argued that regardless of Waters' direct actions, she bore the ultimate responsibility for removing her daughter from a safe environment, knowingly bringing her into a dangerous one, and failing to protect her from the subsequent harm that led to her death. The legal process concluded in 2025. In April, Marshall pleaded guilty to neglect of a dependent resulting in death, and as part of her agreement, she consented to testify against Waters. In June, a judge sentenced her to 25 years in prison. Weeks later, Waters accepted a separate plea deal, receiving a 45-year sentence for his role in the events that led to Oakley's death. The sentencing hearings were described as being filled with profound sorrow. Oakley's father spoke of the immense grief of losing his daughter, detailing the future milestones she would never reach and the permanent void her absence created. He described her gentle spirit and the reality that he would never hold her again. For the community, Oakley's case became a symbol of a betrayal of the fundamental trust between a child and a caregiver. Memorials with stuffed animals and candles were created in her honor, a public acknowledgement of a life that would not be forgotten. Her death prompted calls for stronger protections for children in unstable domestic situations, highlighting that the most significant threats can often come from within a child's own family circle. Oakley Snow's life, though brief, serves as a powerful reminder of the vulnerability of children when their protectors fail them. Her memory endures as a quiet plea for society to pay attention, to speak up, and to protect the children who cannot protect themselves. When a child is caught between a safe guardian and a parent struggling with instability, what is the clear line at which the state's responsibility to intervene must override the biological parent's rights to prevent a tragic, yet foreseeable, outcome? The search for 10-year-old Skylee Carmack began on a warm September evening in Gas City, Indiana, after she was reported missing. Her stepmother, Amanda Carmack, initially informed neighbors and law enforcement that Skylee had run away from home following an argument. In response, the community mobilized. Flyers with Skylee's picture were distributed, search parties organized to comb the streets, and a collective hope was held for the young girl's safe return. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. Skylee was known as a lively and sweet-natured child with a passion for gymnastics and crafts. Her bright smile and friendly disposition were well known in her community. At just 10 years old, she had aspirations of becoming a teacher, hoping to share kindness with others. However, her home life was reportedly difficult. Skylee lived with her father, Kevin, and her stepmother, Amanda, as part of a blended family with several other children. Accounts from friends and relatives later suggested she was a child who sought affection but was often caught in the middle of domestic tensions. This raises an important question for any community. How often are the internal struggles of a family completely invisible to the outside world? On September 1st, 2019, Skylee's life came to a tragic end. That evening, following what investigators later determined was an argument, Amanda Carmack took Skylee to a shed on their property. It was there that the cause of death was determined to be manual strangulation. Afterward, the person responsible concealed Skylee's remains inside a plastic trash bag. For several days, the community continued its frantic search, unaware that their efforts were in vain. Volunteers scoured neighborhoods and nearby wooded areas, calling her name. During this time, Amanda maintained the appearance of a concerned stepmother, reiterating to police that Skylee had a history of running away. She actively participated in the deception, watching as the community rallied to find a child whose fate she already knew. The facade began to crumble as investigators identified contradictions in Amanda's account of the events. Discrepancies in her timeline, combined with surveillance footage and interviews with neighbors, led law enforcement to focus their attention on the family property. A search of the home and the small shed behind it was conducted. Inside the shed, they discovered Skylee's remains inside a plastic garbage bag. The confirmation of her death sent a shockwave through the community of Gas City. The hope that had united the town now turned to collective grief. The realization that the harm had come not from a stranger, but from within her own home, was a devastating blow. Amanda was taken into custody immediately. During questioning, she eventually admitted her responsibility for Skylee's death, stating that she had acted out of anger because the child had been misbehaving. Her confession was described by investigators as being delivered with a detached demeanor, lacking the emotional response one might associate with such a devastating event. The subsequent trial garnered statewide attention. The prosecution presented Amanda Carmack as a manipulative individual, emphasizing the deliberate nature of the act and the calculated steps taken to conceal it afterward. While the defense explored arguments related to diminished responsibility, the evidence presented was substantial. In 2021, Amanda Carmack was found guilty on charges of murder, strangulation, and neglect of a dependent. The court imposed a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. This sentence was later upheld by the Indiana Supreme Court in 2023, solidifying the legal outcome. Today, Amanda Carmack is incarcerated, her name now associated with one of the state's most troubling cases involving a child's death. For Skylee's family and the Gas City community, the legal process provided a measure of justice, but the loss remains profound. Skylee is remembered as a bright girl whose future was taken from her. The aftermath of her death left a permanent mark on the town. Memorials and candlelight vigils were held to honor her memory. Friends, teachers, and classmates spoke of her spirit and kindness, struggling to comprehend the circumstances of her death. Skylee's story serves as a somber case study of the ultimate betrayal of trust, a child whose life was ended not by an external threat, but by the hands of a primary caregiver. In cases of domestic tragedy, where the danger to a child is concealed behind the closed doors of their own home, how can a community learn to look beyond the immediate narrative and recognize the subtle signs of a crisis before it's too late? In the spring of 2024, a tragic event involving a 10-year-old boy named Dakota Levi Stevens brought intense scrutiny to Indiana's foster care system. Dakota was described by those who knew him as a boy with a bright smile and a tender heart who desired what every child deserves, a safe and loving home. His story is a particularly poignant case study in how a child can be vulnerable even within a system designed for their protection. Accounts from his life paint a picture of a kind and gentle boy who, despite experiencing instability, still hoped for a sense of belonging. In one telling anecdote, a neighbor recalled Dakota asking if they would adopt him, a simple question from a child that revealed a profound yearning for safety and permanency. That opportunity would never materialize. On April 27, 2024, emergency services were dispatched to a residence in Indiana following a report of an unresponsive boy. Upon arrival, they found Dakota. Despite their efforts, he could not be revived. The forensic evidence indicated that the cause of death was related to suffocation. The investigation immediately focused on the individual entrusted with his care, his foster mother, Jennifer Lee Wilson. During interviews with law enforcement, Wilson admitted to restraining Dakota by lying across his body as a disciplinary measure, stating she was frustrated with his behavior. What this action resulted in, however, was a fatal application of pressure that restricted the boy's ability to breathe. The coroner later ruled Dakota's death a homicide caused by mechanical asphyxia. The news of this outcome sent shockwaves through the community, prompting widespread anger and difficult questions. How could such an event occur in a foster home, a placement intended to be a sanctuary for vulnerable children? For Dakota's relatives and the wider community, the reality of his final moments was devastating. Jennifer Wilson was arrested and charged with reckless homicide. The case garnered significant media attention, both for the tragic circumstances of Dakota's death and for the systemic questions it raised about the foster care system itself. The person who had been vetted and approved to provide safety had become the direct cause of fatal harm. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. In October 2024, Wilson entered a guilty plea, and on January 17, 2025, she appeared in a Lawrence County courtroom for sentencing. The judge handed down a sentence of 6 years in prison, with 1 year suspended to probation. This meant she would serve 5 years incarcerated, with the final year under community supervision. The announcement of the sentence was met with a sense of disbelief. To many observers, a 5-year term of incarceration seemed disproportionate to the loss of a child's life, sparking a debate on how the justice system measures accountability. For Dakota's family, the legal outcome could not address their profound grief. They remembered his innocence and his longing for love, and were left to contemplate the future milestones he would never reach. The community was similarly shaken, with Dakota's death serving as a painful reminder of the vulnerabilities faced by children in state care. It forced a public conversation about the screening process for foster parents and whether any warning signs had been missed. Today, Jennifer Wilson is serving her sentence. In a few years, she will be eligible for release, while Dakota remains forever 10 years old. His name is now a somber reminder of a life cut short and a system that, in his case, failed to deliver on its promise of protection. His story is a call to action to safeguard children who cannot protect themselves and to ensure that the quiet pleas of a child for safety and love are always heard. When a child is placed into the care of the state for their protection, and the state's chosen caregiver becomes the source of harm, who bears the ultimate responsibility for a system that failed its most fundamental promise? On the night of November 10, 2012, the Richmond Hill neighborhood on the south side of Indianapolis experienced an explosion of such significant magnitude that its sound was reported for miles. The event shattered windows, caused structural collapses, and prompted residents to evacuate into the streets amidst the confusion. Within minutes, a tranquil suburban block was transformed into a scene of immense destruction. The blast resulted in the fatal injuries of 2 residents, John and Jennifer Longworth. Dozens of others sustained injuries of varying severity. The event led to the destruction of approximately 30 homes, with initial damage estimates exceeding $4 million. Families who had been secure in their homes just moments before found themselves emerging from collapsed structures, seeking to account for loved ones and neighbors amidst the ensuing fires and debris. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. Initially, the incident was investigated as a potential accident, such as a natural gas leak. However, as the investigation proceeded, evidence began to suggest the event was intentional. The focal point of the blast was traced to the residence of Montserrat Shirley, a 47-year-old mother and nurse who lived there with her boyfriend, Mark Leonard, and her young daughter. While the couple presented a conventional suburban image, they were reportedly facing significant financial difficulties. Investigators ultimately concluded the explosion was not accidental, but a deliberate act intended to commit insurance fraud. The plan, as determined by the investigation, was to intentionally fill the home with natural gas and ignite it to cause a fire, with the goal of collecting an insurance payout. However, the execution of this plan resulted in a massive detonation that affected the entire neighborhood. As these details became public in the weeks following the event, the community's collective grief began to shift to a sense of anger and betrayal. The realization that the destruction was the result of a calculated financial scheme was a difficult one for the residents to process. Compounding this was the revelation that Shirley and Leonard had arranged for her daughter to be away from the home for the weekend, a measure that ensured her safety while leaving the surrounding neighborhood and its residents exposed to the catastrophic risk. This specific detail raises a critical question. How does one reconcile the act of protecting one's own child while simultaneously endangering the children and families of an entire community? During the legal proceedings, the prosecution depicted Shirley as a willing participant in a plan that gambled with numerous lives for financial gain, presenting evidence of the couple's financial distress and her direct involvement in preparing the home. The defense argued that Shirley had been manipulated by Mark Leonard. In 2015, Montserrat Shirley entered into a plea agreement, pleading guilty to 2 counts of murder, arson, and conspiracy. In exchange for her testimony against the other involved parties, she received 2 consecutive life sentences plus an additional 50 years. In her court admission, she acknowledged her awareness of the risks the plan posed to her neighbors. Mark Leonard, identified as the primary planner, was subsequently convicted and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. His brother, Bob Leonard, also received multiple life sentences for his role. Today, Montserrat Shirley is incarcerated, serving her sentence within the Indiana prison system. The Richmond Hill neighborhood has been physically rebuilt, but the psychological and emotional scars from the event remain. The case left a significant mark on the state, not just because of the scale of the physical destruction, but because of the calculated nature of the act behind it. The victims, John and Jennifer Longworth, are remembered as kind members of the community whose lives were cut short. The Richmond Hill explosion is now a permanent part of Indiana's criminal history, serving as a sobering reminder of the devastating and far-reaching consequences that can result from a single decision driven by financial desperation. When an act is intended to cause a specific, contained outcome for financial gain but results in a far greater and unintended catastrophe, how should the justice system weigh the initial intent against the final, devastating consequences? In late November of 2022, a call from a residence in Lawrence County, Indiana, brought first responders to a critical situation involving a 9-month-old child. The toddler, Eleliana Plummer, was found unresponsive. At an age typically marked by first words and exploration, she instead presented with signs of severe physical distress and trauma. Initial observations indicated the child was significantly underweight and malnourished. Upon arrival at IU Health Bedford Hospital, medical professionals identified the full extent of her condition, which included intracranial bleeding, significant skeletal trauma, including a fractured collarbone, and widespread bruising. The severity of these findings necessitated an immediate airlift to the specialized Riley Hospital for Children in Indianapolis. For 3 days, medical teams worked to stabilize her, but the trauma proved to be insurmountable. Eleliana passed away on November 26, 2022. The official cause of death was determined to be blunt force head trauma, and the case was ruled a homicide. However, the investigation uncovered a broader context of sustained neglect. Medical evidence indicated the child was severely malnourished, a condition that would have developed over an extended period. This raises a critical question. At what point does a failure to provide care cross the line from a parental struggle to a criminal act of neglect? Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. The investigation centered on her mother, 3-year-old Cheyenne Hill. The prosecution's case argued that a critical failure was the delay in seeking medical attention for the child's head injury. This delay, compounded by the pre-existing state of neglect, was presented as a direct cause of the fatal outcome. The legal and social contract implies that a caregiver is the ultimate protector of a child. The evidence presented in this case suggested a fundamental breakdown of that responsibility. Family and friends described Eleliana as a child with sparkling eyes who deserved a full life of birthdays and bedtime stories. Instead, her final days were spent in a state of severe distress. The details presented in the Lawrence County courtroom were harrowing, focusing on the evidence of long-standing neglect and the expert testimony regarding Eleliana's physical condition long before the final, fatal injury. The proceedings underscored that had the child received proper nutrition and timely medical care, the outcome could have been different. On April 23, 2024, Cheyenne Hill was sentenced to 30 years in prison for neglect of a dependent, resulting in death. The courtroom's reaction was reportedly one of solemnity, a recognition that the legal conclusion could not reverse the tragic events. In the Lawrence County community, Eleliana's death prompted vigils and calls for greater public awareness. Advocacy groups used the case to emphasize the importance of recognizing and reporting the signs of child neglect and abuse, framing it as a collective responsibility. Eleliana's story, though tragically short, concluded with a powerful message that reverberated through the community. That silence in the face of a child's suffering can have fatal consequences, and that every indicator of distress warrants attention. Though she was only 19 months old, her case carries a lesson far beyond her years. When a child's well-being is entirely dependent on the choices of their caregiver, what is the moral and practical line between respecting a family's privacy and a community's duty to protect its most vulnerable members? Just before sunrise in the small town of Darlington, Indiana, an emergency call was placed to 911. The dispatcher heard a woman's voice, noted as being calm and steady, making a startling confession regarding herself and her 2 children. The caller was identified as 9-year-old Brandi Worley, and she was referring to her son and daughter, 7-year-old Tyler and 3-year-old Charlie. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. This single event would irrevocably alter the course of their family's life. Tyler was described as a bright and curious child who enjoyed building with Legos and was skilled at video games. His younger sister, Charlie, was known for her vibrant personality, often seen happily following her older brother. They were, by all accounts, children cherished by their father, Jason, and the wider community. To understand the circumstances leading to this tragic event, it's necessary to examine the family's situation. To observers, the Worleys appeared to be a typical young family. Jason was employed as a software engineer, while Brandi was a stay-at-home mother. They were active in their community, seen at social and school functions. However, beneath this public exterior, the marital relationship was under significant strain. Jason had reportedly discovered that Brandi was involved in an affair, and in the days immediately preceding the incident, he had initiated divorce proceedings. For Jason, filing for divorce was a step towards a new chapter. For Brandi, it seems this action triggered a severe response. On the night of November 16, 2016, Jason slept in the basement after a tense argument. Upstairs, after putting her children to bed, Brandi entered their rooms with a combat-style knife that records indicate she had purchased from a local Walmart just the day before. According to the investigation, Tyler was attacked first in his sleep, followed by Charlie. The children sustained fatal injuries from the weapon. Afterward, Brandi inflicted a non-lethal injury to her own neck. It was after these events that she placed the call to 911. When law enforcement arrived at the residence, they were met with a deeply distressing scene. The two children were found deceased in their bedrooms, and forensic evidence was present. Jason, who had been asleep in the basement, came upstairs to discover the outcome of the night's events. Responding officers noted the profound silence in the home, punctuated only by Jason's expressions of grief. Brandi was present and reportedly appeared calm, later telling investigators her actions were motivated by a desire to prevent Jason from gaining custody. The investigation concluded that Brandi's actions were premeditated, following Jason's divorce filing. She confessed that her motive was related to the custody of the children and a desire to ensure Jason would experience profound loss. The detached nature of her confession was noted by investigators as unusual. Reports from her questioning indicate she displayed little emotion or remorse, reiterating that her actions ensured Jason would not get the children. This raises a critical question. How can the justice system and society differentiate between an act of profound mental distress and one of calculated revenge? The stated motive was unambiguous. If the marital unit could not be preserved, the entire family structure would be dismantled by her actions. In 2018, Brandi Worley appeared in a Montgomery County courtroom and pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. During the proceedings, Jason Worley delivered a victim impact statement. He spoke about his love for Tyler and Charlie, the permanent void their absence created in his life, and the profound impact of Brandi's decisions. He emotionally conveyed the ongoing struggle of knowing he was unable to prevent the outcome of that night. After hearing the statements, Judge Harry Samus delivered the sentence. He sentenced Brandi to 120 years in prison, 60 years for each count, representing each child's life. In his remarks, the judge stated, "The maximum sentence is the only appropriate sentence. The pain you caused is beyond words." Observers in the courtroom noted that Brandi displayed little visible reaction as the sentence was announced. Today, Brandi Worley is incarcerated at the Indiana Women's Prison. Under the terms of her sentence, she will not be eligible for parole consideration until she is of advanced age. Jason has since focused on rebuilding his life, though he continues to carry the immense grief from the loss of his children. He has spoken publicly about his healing process, stating that he honors the memory of Tyler and Charlie every day. The deaths of Tyler and Charlie Worley had a lasting impact on the Darlington community and the state of Indiana. Residents remember the children and the potential their lives held, a potential cut short by the individual tasked with their protection. Their case is a somber and significant example of filicide, the act of a parent taking the life of their own child. When a parent is responsible for the death of their child, it presents a scenario so difficult to comprehend that it compels society to search for answers. The memory of this case continues to resonate, serving as a stark reminder that profound harm can originate not just from external threats, but also from within the family unit itself. In Darlington, Indiana, the community ensures that the names Tyler and Charlie are not forgotten. When a tragedy like this stems from a domestic dispute, what responsibility does a community have to recognize warning signs, and what systems could possibly intervene before a situation reaches a point of no return? In May of 2012, law enforcement in Richmond, Indiana, responded to a call that would lead to a deeply unsettling discovery at a home on South 16th Street. Inside, emergency responders found a 4-month-old infant boy, known in court records as Caden H., who was deceased. The infant's physical condition was alarming to the first responders. He showed signs of severe emaciation, a stark contrast to records indicating he had been born a healthy, normal weight. His condition suggested a significant decline in health over a period of time. Investigators would later conclude that the infant's death was the result of being deprived of basic sustenance, namely food and water. His brief, 4-month life was not one of typical infant development, but rather a gradual deterioration of health. For the community, and later for the jury, the circumstances were difficult to process, as they involved a child completely dependent on his caregiver for survival. The investigation quickly focused on the infant's mother, two-year-old Amy Hockett. Interviews with neighbors and family painted a complex picture of a young woman described as detached and overwhelmed by her circumstances. However, the investigation also noted that various support systems, including welfare programs, family assistance, and medical services, were available in the community but had not been utilized. This raises a critical question about the barriers, both internal and external, that may prevent a parent from accessing available resources, even in a dire situation. The results of the medical examination were conclusive. Medical professionals testified that the infant had succumbed to severe malnutrition and dehydration. They explained that for a child to reach such a critical state, the deprivation would have had to occur over an extended period of days or even weeks. This timeline suggested that there had been numerous opportunities for intervention that were missed. The prosecution argued this was not a case of a momentary lapse in judgment, but rather a prolonged period of neglect. When the case proceeded to trial in 2014, the atmosphere in the courtroom was somber. Medical experts provided detailed testimony about the infant's condition, presenting evidence that illustrated the severity of his physical state. The prosecution's position was that Amy Hockett had not simply neglected her son, but had knowingly allowed his condition to worsen over time. The defense countered with the argument that Amy was a young, struggling mother who was overwhelmed and lacked adequate support, framing her actions as grave mistakes rather than intentional harm. However, the evidence of the infant's prolonged and visible suffering was a central point of the trial. The jury was tasked with weighing the difference between a parent who makes a tragic error and one who engages in a pattern of fatal neglect. Ultimately, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Amy Hockett was convicted of murder and neglect of a dependent, resulting in death. During sentencing, the judge imposed a 60-year prison sentence, remarking that the crime represented a betrayal of trust so fundamental that it was difficult to articulate. Reports from the courtroom noted that Amy displayed little emotion as the sentence was read, while family members present reacted with audible grief for the child. Today, Amy Hockett remains incarcerated within the Indiana Department of Correction. In the community of Richmond, the case is remembered with profound sadness. The infant's death prompted difficult questions about how such severe neglect could go unnoticed. Could neighbors have observed something? Could family members have intervened more forcefully? Did the social safety net have gaps that this case exposed? These questions linger, serving as a painful reminder of the incident. The story of Caden H. is considered one of Indiana's most tragic cases, not because of a single act of violence, but because of the slow, quiet nature of the neglect he endured. His case remains a chilling example that the most profound harm is not always the result of an overt, aggressive act. Sometimes it is the result of what is fundamentally withheld: nourishment, care, and basic human attention. When neglect occurs silently, behind closed doors, what is the role of a community in seeing the unseen and speaking for those who cannot speak for themselves? On a cool September afternoon in Elkhart, Indiana, police dispatch received an urgent call regarding two missing children. 7-year-old Liliana Hernandez and 6-year-old Renee Pasztor had been taken from their grandparents' residence by their mother, Amber Pasztor. Initially, the situation was perceived as a potential parental custody issue, with hopes for a swift resolution. However, within a matter of hours, the circumstances escalated into a tragedy far more severe than anyone had anticipated. Liliana was described as a creative girl with a cheerful disposition, while her younger brother, René, was known for his adventurous and inquisitive nature. The children had been placed in the care of their grandparents due to an unstable home environment with their mother. For Liliana and René, their grandparents' home represented a place of safety and stability. That sense of security was broken on September 26, 2016, when Amber arrived and insisted on taking the children with her. Soon after, an Amber Alert was issued across Indiana, signaling that 2 children were in danger and were last seen with their mother. Law enforcement initiated a search, operating under the hope of a safe recovery. However, Amber Pasztor had already determined a different outcome. As the investigation would later reveal, she drove with the children for several hours. During her subsequent statements to police, she claimed to be experiencing intense paranoia, believing a cartel was targeting her family and that the children would be safer if they were no longer alive. Whether this explanation stemmed from a genuine delusion, was a form of manipulation, or was a calculated justification, remains a central question in this complex case. What is known is that at some point during the drive, Amber pulled her vehicle over. Inside the car, she caused the deaths of both of her children through asphyxiation. The evidence suggests she first took the life of Liliana and then René. When her vehicle eventually arrived and stopped at the Elkhart Police Department, officers were confronted with a deeply disturbing scene. Amber calmly exited the car and informed the police that her children were deceased in the back seat. Officers found the 2 young siblings, lifeless, still secured in their car seats. The moment was described by responding officers as one of the most distressing they had ever encountered in their careers. Amber was immediately taken into custody. During her interrogation, she admitted responsibility for the deaths of Liliana and René, repeating her claim that she acted out of fear that someone else would harm them. However, the prosecution presented a different motive. They argued that her actions were not about protection, but about possession and control, a refusal to allow her children to live a life separate from her, even if it meant ending their lives. The case took another disturbing turn 2 years later, in 2018. While already incarcerated, Amber confessed to another homicide. She admitted that just prior to taking her children, she had fatally shot her former neighbor, 5-year-old Frank Macomber, and had stolen his car, which she then used to abduct the children. Mr. Macomber, a man described as quiet and kind, became another victim in this sequence of violent events. In court, prosecutors characterized Amber as a manipulative and dangerous individual who made deliberate choices. The defense did not pursue an insanity plea. The prosecution argued that the events were the result of calculated actions. In 2017, she pleaded guilty, but mentally ill, to the charges related to the deaths of Liliana and René. A judge sentenced her to 130 years in prison. Subsequently, she received an additional 65-year sentence for the murder of Frank Macomber. Today, Amber Pasztor is serving her sentences at the Indiana Women's Prison, with no possibility of parole. Her children, Liliana and René, are remembered as bright young individuals whose lives were tragically cut short by the person who was meant to be their ultimate protector. The Pasztor case sent shockwaves through the state, not only due to the tragic details, but because it highlighted potential vulnerabilities in the systems designed to protect at-risk children. Despite being placed with relatives for their safety, the children were still accessible to their mother. Their deaths serve as a painful reminder that significant danger to children can sometimes originate from within the family unit itself. In the aftermath, the children's father, René Hernandez, spoke of his profound loss, stating he could never forgive Amber's actions. Their grandparents, who had been entrusted with their care, were left devastated and haunted by the memory of Amber driving away with the children for the last time. Amber Pasztor's case is now a permanent part of Indiana's criminal history, a story of a mother who was found responsible for the deaths of her 2 children and her neighbor. Ultimately, she will spend the remainder of her life incarcerated, leaving society to grapple with the complex intersection of mental health, parental rights, and personal accountability. How should a society balance the fundamental rights of a parent with the absolute necessity to protect a child when clear and present warning signs of instability are documented? Thank you for watching until the end of the video. Your time, attention, and curiosity are what make this space possible, a place dedicated to examining the most complex, mysterious, and unsettling cases from around the world. Today, we explored facts, testimonies, and theories that challenge not only our understanding of justice, but also our perception of human nature and the systems that sometimes fail to provide answers. What do you think about this case? Do the explanations presented make sense to you, or do you believe there are still hidden truths waiting to be uncovered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective helps enrich this conversation and build a thoughtful community where every opinion counts. Tell us what stood out to you the most, what made you question things, or what moved you personally. If you found this content insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss future uploads. Each week, we bring you new cases, deep investigations, and detailed analyses aimed at understanding what truly lies behind these stories. Thank you for being part of a community that looks beyond headlines and seeks to understand the truth with empathy and critical thinking. We'll see you in the next video with more cases, more analysis, and more truth. Until then, take care and remember, sometimes the truth is closer than it seems.